everyone, and welcome to Fresh Parchment. My name is Heather, and today I'm going to be doing my June book haul. First up are two books that I bought from a bargain bookstore online, and the first one is The Poison Thread by Laura Purcell. The Poison Thread is a story of two young women, one of whom is in prison, and the other of whom is a phrenologist, someone who believed it was possible to study the shape of a person's skull and tell a lot about them, especially their deepest, darkest secrets. And as she begins to get to know the imprisoned young woman, she begins to wonder, is it possible to kill with just a needle and thread? This has very much Alias Grace vibes, and I'm very, very excited to read it. It's also called The Corset if you're in the UK. Next up from that same bargain bookstore is The Testament of Loki, which is a follow-up to The Gospel of Loki, which I read several years ago and absolutely loved. So these books are just retellings of the Norse myths from Loki's perspective. Now you all know I love Loki in his many, many forms, so I'm very, very excited to read this. Interestingly enough, Joanne Harris also wrote Chocolat. Next up is a book that my lovely friend Veronica very kindly lent me called The Skin I'm In, which is just looking at school from a black child's perspective. I believe this child is between 10 or 12 years old, but don't quote me on that, I'm not sure. And given the Black Lives Matter movement and everything that's going on, we thought it would be very important to read this before going back to school in the fall as teachers. Next up, I bought myself 3 short stories by Colette, the first of which is Gigi, and yes, this is the short story that inspired the musical Gigi. There are also 2 other short stories, Julie de Carnelin and Chance Acquaintances. I read The Complete Claudine by Colette about a year and a half ago now, and I just rewatched the film about her life, so I'm very, very inspired to read this. For those of you who don't know, Colette was a French writer around the turn of the 20th century, and she broke so many norms, so many rules. She was absolutely fascinating, and so I'm very intrigued to see her perspective on a young woman in Gigi, a young woman who is essentially being trained to become a courtesan. Things you don't realize when you watch the musical when you're 10 years old. Next up are 5 books that I treated myself to from the UK because, quite frankly, these editions are out now in the UK and they're not necessarily available here in the US, and they're also just much prettier, plain and simple. So the first of those is Kim Jiyoung, born 1982, by nam-joo, and this is a book about Kim Jiyoung, who is in her early 30s by now, and all of the domestic and commercial and societal problems that she faces just for being a young woman. And this was translated from the Korean, and apparently this book was a huge spark for Korea to start looking at its societal norms and seeing how they could change them to become more feminist. So I'm very, very excited to read something from that perspective. Next up is one that everyone that I know has been talking about, and that is The Mercies by Kieran Millwood Hargrave. This is a story of a small island somewhere in Scandinavia, Iceland. Let me take a look. Yes, Norway. It's a small Norwegian island where one day all the men go out to fish. It is a fishing village, and there's a huge storm and all of the men are drowned. And so this island becomes an island of women. And these women learn to become self-sufficient, keep the island running, raise their children. But then one man, a missionary man, finds the island and begins to try to restructure the island to the way that it was. And I mean, just look at this. This is stunning, it's beautiful, and I absolutely adore the way this looks. Hi, Sorry if my camera angle moved, by the way. I just had to take care of a bug that was crawling along my floor. Next up, I picked up The Bass Rock by Evie Wilde, which is based on a real place. The Bass Rock is a place that my parents have actually been to and climbed all over in Scotland on the coast. And this follows 3 women, one of whom is in either the 17th or the 18th century and has to do with witch trials. The second woman's story takes place in the aftermath of World War II as a new wife struggles to find her place in a new community. And the third is a modern woman who discovers both of their stories and starts to see how all 3 of their lives come together. This sounds absolutely wonderful and it looks really beautiful, so I'm very, very excited to get to this soon. Next up is The Foundling by Stacey Halls. I read The Familiars by Stacey Halls last year and absolutely adored it, so I'm very, very excited to read this one. And this story is about a young woman who has a child out of wedlock, cannot afford to keep this child right away. And so she brings her to a foundling hospital, which were real things in the 18th and 19th centuries. And ordinarily women would leave their children there with some item of clothing or some item that was distinctive to them so that when they had enough money, they could come back and reclaim their child. And they would know that it was their child if they still had the item on them. So this woman leaves her child at the foundling hospital, goes away, works, makes up enough money after many, many years to come back and try and claim her child. But when she comes back, she discovers her child has already been claimed by someone else. And it is the story of her search to try and track down who it is that has claimed her child. And funnily enough, this edition is signed by the author, which is something I did not expect when I ordered it. So that was a lovely, lovely surprise. And finally, a book that has been getting such huge buzz on British BookTube. It is not out in the US yet, but I think it will be in the fall. But I couldn't wait anymore because it just sounded too wonderful. It's Hamlet by Maggie O'Farrell, which, first of all, look how stunning this is. Plus, look at that underneath. It's so pretty. But this is the story of Hamlet, who was William Shakespeare's son, who you know from the start, and indeed from history, that Hamlet died at the age of 11. And it is the story of the rest of the family coming to terms with that and dealing with their grief. And apparently it is beautifully written. I know many people have sobbed through reading it, and I don't typically cry at books, so I'm interested to see if this is one of the few that will get me. So those are some of the books that I picked up in June. Please let me know what you're reading, what you're excited to read, and I will be back with more TBRs and wrap-ups soon. Thanks for watching. Happy reading!